Hey there, it's Tom Jordan. We got I think, a very important program today. Did you know that in the past 5 years alone, more than 5,700 minors across the United States have undergone gender surgeries, with most of these procedures taking place in certain states in this country, kind of concentrated in some of the most liberal leaning states in the United States. That's according to a report by a medical watchdog group. So, what's going on here? We're going to get into this today because it's done under the guise of protecting kids from harming themselves. So, let's get them into this permanent transition process immediately without fully making them aware of all the consequences potentially of these procedures. This report that came out of these thousands of surgeries on kids was put into this national database that is brand new that conservatively identified thousands of minors who received these life altering treatments like sex change surgeries, hormone blockers between the years of 2019 and 2023. And it's an alarming rise in these procedures. And again, the data likely understates the scope of the entire issue. And we'll get into that as well. I guess the question is, does it work? Are these kids who get these gender transition surgeries leading healthy lives, both physically and emotionally and mentally and spiritually? That's just seconds away with my guest here coming up is Jamie Reed, the executive director of the LGBT Courage Coalition and a whistleblower from the Pediatric gender industries. So Jamie knows a lot about this. So that's just seconds away. Also, we'll have more headlines. They are coming up as well after our interview this morning here on Tom Jordan Live. Also, just a reminder to chime in, comment, ask questions. You can ask questions of my guest this morning. We'll answer those in real time in the comments section. If you're watching on YouTube or on X or on Facebook, wherever you're watching, you can put those in there. We will get to it. Cameron's in the back, our director, watching those, and he'll just throw them up on the screen there for my guest, Jamie Reed. I'll get to those in a moment. Also, the best way you can help Tom Jordan Live is simply to subscribe and click that notification bell. It is free of charge. That just helps us out tremendously. So thank you for that. Okay, in a moment, seconds away, I'm going to speak with Jamie Reed. This is her here when she was speaking with Dr. Phil a few months ago regarding the pediatric gender transitioning industry. And by the way, detransitioners who went to rent these treatments as a minor, as a child, they're arguing nowadays that these children are being used as guinea pigs in dangerous and unproven medical experiments. Jamie's going to detail her findings in a few seconds with me, but they're essentially allowing minors, kids in many cases, to make these life-altering decisions like gender reassignment surgery, and it ignores the psychological instability that many teenagers face, and they go right to this quote-unquote solution instead of dealing with some maybe underlying problems that these children are going through. There's a lot of issues that teenagers face, and this isn't always the solution. So the argument that I personally have heard from these activist senators is that now it's an adults-only recourse. It's an adult's job to affirm these kids' decision to physically switch their genders, no matter what their age is. But these procedures often lead to irreversible consequences based on these feelings that almost always change with maturity, like, when they hit puberty. That's a big deal. Jamie Reed is a former case manager at a pediatric gender clinic and has exposed the dangerous and the unethical practices of fast-tracking minors into irreversible gender transitions without proper psychological care or informed consent. And, she's got this whistleblower account revealing all, the vulnerable children had been harmed by these medical professionals. And it's very concerning with these affirming ideology. They're trying to affirm the ideology rather than affirming their young patients and what's best for them. Let's bring in Jamie Reed, the executive director of the LGBT Courage Coalition and a whistleblower from the pediatric gender industry. Jamie, I'm so grateful that you came on. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me this morning, Tom. It's
You,
so nice to be with you.
yeah, thank you so much. There's a lot to get into here, but I do want to start with your story in what is now a rapidly growing industry. First, your support of it and now against it. Take me back to 2018, or even prior to that, if you would like, when you took a job at what's known as the Washington University Transgender Center at St. Louis Children's Hospital. Tell me about that.
Yes, in the heart of the country in Missouri. So I was working as a caseworker, a social work position. I started in 2018 and I was there for close to 4.5 years. And in my tenure there, what I just began to see was increasing numbers of kids that we were harming, both in an ethical medical stance that they weren't getting good informed consent, neither were their parents, and then were being physically harmed. We saw a number of patients who came back and were detransitioning, saying that we had irrevocably and permanently changed their bodies in ways that were going to haunt them forever.
So, back then, I mean, it seems to me that there's been a dramatic increase in the number of kids who are suddenly presenting themselves, maybe not presenting themselves initially with gender dysphoria, but they're being lumped into this category at an increasing rate by some of these, professionals that, yeah, you may have gender dysphoria. So the solution for you is to do, A, B, and C. Can you describe why you believe there's this rise in kids who suddenly have this when prior to, a few years ago, they never had any presentation of these kinds of, symptoms, if you will?
Yeah, so i- the easiest way to describe this is a social contagion. So, what we saw and we've seen across the globe, specifically in countries like Australia, the UK, Europe, and the United States, is this group of primarily girls, adolescent girls, who have been caught up in a social contagion where they are rapidly identifying as transgender. And girls are really susceptible to these kind of contagions. We see that adolescent girls really have a group dynamic where they feel and are empathetic and are really part of their cohort, the other teens around them. And this was coupled at the same time when we saw the horrible lockdowns and the fallout from COVID, where we were basically taking teens and removing them from school, from their peer group in a way that would give them more bodily interactions. And instead, everything became part of social media. And we just saw this exponential rise in these kids declaring that they were trans. And we saw that globally.
Yes, it's around the globe. It's amazing to me how this has happened so quickly on a global scale. And I'll bring this up real quickly. Then I want to get back to your experience. But I had a senator. Her name is Mallory McMorrow, and she is very bold now. She became a celebrity within the Democratic Party. I don't want to get political here, but I'm just explaining what she told me in response to how adults. I asked her, if a child who's maybe in third grade, second grade comes to you or to me and says, "Listen, I know I was born a girl, but I want to become a boy." And I asked her, what should the response as an adult be to that child? And her response was, we just need to affirm whatever that child feels and help her along that journey, because if we don't, that child will likely commit suicide. And I thought, well, what about being the adult and steering? Well, maybe there's an underlying issue here. No, the only responsible decision, according to Mallory McMorrow, and she ended up making millions of dollars off this claim in fundraising. It was incredibly irresponsible, but she still stands firm on this. The only response from an adult is to do what that child wants to do with his or her body. Um, I know it sounds good on the surface because nobody wants anybody to kill themselves, but that's the kind of fear mongering I believe that's leading to this social contagion that you say is rapidly increasing across the world. What do you say to someone who makes that kind of a claim that this is the best thing for the child, no matter what you think as an adult?
So, a couple things. First, we refer to that as the suicide myth. So, this is a myth that if you do not immediately affirm a child, then you are raising the worry or the specter of suicide. We do not see that statistically play out. There is not a high number of completed suicides in these groups. The other thing is it's just not the right way to publicly talk about suicide. So suicide can also become a social contagion. So the right way to talk about suicide is to not be publicly basically teaching kids to get what you want, you have to just make the threat of suicide. And as far as what to do for parents or adults when we have a young person telling us that they are in some kind of distress, which is really what it is. These kids are basically saying, I'm feeling distress. And for them, they're using these words that they've probably picked up from either their teachers, their classrooms, social media, that their distress is related to gender. We go back, and as good adults, we need to look at underlying distress. Is the child sleeping enough, getting exercise, going outside, playing with their peers, doing things that are kid related? Get them out of social media. And unfortunately, sometimes this also means get them out of some of these classrooms where we have teachers who are basically teaching the whole classroom, oh, we're all going to be trans now.
Hmm.
Um, Gender distress can be real. It is often something that we see in kids that will grow up to be gay adults. But for the vast majority of these kids, they just need adults to be the adults, guide them and tell them we are not physically changing our body. We're going to address your distress in the proper ways.
You mentioned social media. How much of a role do you think social media plays in all of this, social contagion?
So it's interesting. We've seen social contagions historically, but they're almost always grouped geographically. So if you
Hmm.
get a bunch of teens together and they all believe that they have tics or um, we've seen social contagions play out historically, but it was always linked back to being close proximity. Social media has completely blown that out of the water. So we've seen, especially post-pandemic, things like TikTok tics, where kids all believe that they have tic disorders and they're playing it out through their TikTok and Instagram videos. We've also seen a number of teens who believe that they have multiple personality disorders. We've even seen kids now who believe that they are Therians or furries or identifying as animals. And so much of this is socially mediated. It is being spread and pushed through the algorithms that social media gives you. You start going down a rabbit hole of videos, the algorithm will just inundate you with that same topic over and over and over again.
I don't understand what's wrong with adults because you mentioned the furries and all that kind of thing. I mean, this completely unrealistic view of what children have of themselves. But you mentioned teachers. Teachers are now being told they have to affirm whatever the child. And so, if a child comes to school in the second grade and believes that he or she is a cat, you have to believe on their behalf that he or she is a cat. And I know this is happening in this state of Michigan. Teachers are saying we have to pretend that this kid in my class is a cat room crawling around the floor with a litter box. It's insane what's happening. I mean, that being said, I want to go back to the clinic where you worked in St. Louis because I know that you went in for it, which would you believe were the right reasons to help kids who are having this social distress from wherever it came from. And so, can you describe the process of what you initially believed about this, and what led you to a different belief about what was really happening to these kids?
Absolutely. So I went into working in this clinic thinking that there was really strong scientific evidence and a really strong protocol where we had a way to identify the children who would have lifetime gender dysphoria, and that we would only be moving forward to medicalize those children who we had scientific evidence that they would potentially have lifetime issues with their gender. The longer that I was there, the more I really dug into what the scientific basis for this was, and I found it to be completely lacking. This was based on a small number of studies that had been started in the Netherlands. When they attempted to reproduce this study in the UK, in England, they actually found that they could not reproduce the benefits that they had found in the Netherlands. They buried that evidence, and this had jumped over into the United States. This was essentially a science experiment to permanently change kids' bodies that came over here and spread like wildfire across the US. We're now seeing that the UK has completely scaled this back. There was a huge report done over 4 years in England called the Cass report. She found that there is not good evidence to do this in kids, and they have completely rolled back this concept in the UK, in Finland, in Sweden. This is really the science was not there to support this. And we all just experimented on kids in
Yeah.
ethical ways that should never have occurred.
So we have case studies that we can look at. You can look at Sweden. You can look at the United Kingdom. They went through this process already that we are now currently going through in this country. And you mentioned something that they're bearing the evidence here that this is a science experiment. But if it's truly a science experiment, why are they bearing the evidence? I mean, what's the root cause or the ultimate goal here? If they know the evidence shows otherwise, that this is actually doing harm to kids, why go through with it in your view?
So there's a few elements. First, I believe that a lot of people who work in this industry are ideologically captured. So they're coming at this from an ideological viewpoint, not based on the science, not based on how we safeguard and keep kids safe. They are so bought into this as being the new civil rights era that they are unable to stop and pause and look at the evidence. The other thing in the US is this just makes money. This makes money in these centers. A procedure, if you start a kid on a puberty blocker, cross sex hormones, surgical care, you're talking millions of dollars over the lifetime. You're creating lifetime pharmaceutical patients. And that makes hospitals and doctors money. They're making money off of this.
Yeah, and I've heard it's quite lucrative. I've heard it from other testimony from other children's hospital. I forget where now. I'm not going to mention it, but I know that there's a number across the country. Yours was the St. Louis Children's Hospital, and describe some of the, so a child, comes in, they're somehow diagnosed somehow with a gender dysphoria. So I know that prescriptions start going out with like testosterone or estrogen, depending on the birth gender of this particular patient. How quickly does that happen? How quickly are they diagnosed and then put into this, whatever the protocol is for the treatment for this particular child?
Yeah, so one of the issues with this care model is it's completely Russian roulette. And we actually saw the same thing in the England clinic. So you could come into my clinic and you could have one visit with an endocrinologist. You could have had one visit with a therapist, and you already were approved to start a lifetime of medical treatments. But some kids came in and they saw a therapist 37 times and then had 3 visits with the endocrinologist. The kind of care is completely inconsistent. And there are some parents from my clinic who believe that their kids got great care and that their kids are doing well in the short term. But then there are also a huge number of kids who could have walked out with a prescription after a 30-minute consultation with an endocrinologist. The prescriptions, if you get to these clinics early enough, you start with a puberty blocker. The out of pocket cost for a puberty blocker is the same as a new car.
Yeah.
$30,000 was the cost for the implant for a puberty blocker. You move on from the puberty blocker to testosterone or some of the feminizing hormones. And then, really, the bread and butter in this industry is in the surgeries. These surgeries are intensive. They have really poor outcomes, especially if you're talking about any genital surgeries. And they just really create lifetime patients where they're going in over and over again for revisions and follow-up care surgically. This is really, really gruesome stuff, especially the surgeries on the physical body.
Okay, this is amazing, and this is so troubling because I know there's, as you mentioned, there's lifelong consequences to this. There's lifelong, the outcomes are poor, as you touched on. Before we get further down that road, I want to remind people, because we get a lot of pushback when we discuss these issues, and the media will not touch this because of the severe pushback from politicians and from advertisers and the intimidation that goes on. And I've experienced it. I know you have, but I want people to understand who you are. That you explain your
Yeah.
background, what it is you do as the executive director of your organization, who you're married to. Let's get that out in the open.
Yeah, so I'm a lifelong liberal Democrat. I came out as a lesbian in high school. I've been in the LGBT community for most of my life. My spouse was trans identified, had medically transitioned at 30, and is actually now going through a process of detransitioning and um, stopping those medications and trying to realign with her birth sex. But I am not coming at this out of hatred or bigotry. This is my community, and I am coming at this because I believe that we are harming the kids in my community. We are harming my community.
Hmm. Well, good. I'm glad you said that because I don't think most people who are opposed to what's happening are coming. I mean, some people are, and I know you know that out of hatred and whatnot, but I'm not. I happen to be conservative, and I happen to be, heterosexual, male, and I'm white. But people say because of those attributes that I'm somehow I hate people. I love children. I've got many of my own. And so, just so people understand this baseline, we're concerned about what's happening to kids in this country and the future adults who will ultimately most often regret their decisions. So, your spouse, Tiger Reed, is now going through a detransition. Explain that scenario. And then I'm going to take a question from a viewer here in just a moment. But explain Tiger Reed's dilemma.
Yeah, so my spouse had started on testosterone, I believe about 13 years ago. Had had top surgery, so had a mastectomy, a bilateral breast mastectomy. And what my spouse experienced is what many detransitioners are experiencing. So one of the issues is that these treatments are really tough on the body. So she had begun to experience a number of physical harms just by being on testosterone for that long. Cholesterol, blood pressure, pre-diabetic. It really does send the body into an endocrine disruptive system. We are sexed human beings. I should not have huge amounts of testosterone in my body. It's going to have lifelong consequences. And I think part of it was that she just recognized that she was going to be losing years of her life if she continued on that trajectory. The other element for individuals who medically change their bodies is there is this disconnect where you always know that you are female and you are presenting to the world as male, and there really is this really strong internal issue for a lot of people. I hear from a lot of detransitioners who stuck to it for 10, 15 years that they could never reconcile that they felt like they were lying to the world.
Mm.
Some detransitioners come out really quick and say this was not the right thing for me, especially the ones that were younger, 19, 20 when they started. But we're going to be seeing detransitioners of all ages in this country for years to come with medical complications because of what we've done to them.
It's ironic, isn't it? Because they're being told that you need to become your true self. And that's one of the reasons why you need to have this gender transition surgery. And as you just said, detransitioners feel like they're lying to the world in their newfound changed body. If you don't mind, I promised I would take questions from the
Yeah.
audience. We have one here. We want to get. I haven't seen it yet, but we're going to put it on the screen, and I will read it for our guest Jamie Reed. Cameron, if you can throw that up on the screen. All right, Donna Donald. False information can speed internet. You are talking about things with no receipts. You are saying things with no proof. Donna Donald, Jamie Reed, how would you like to respond to that?
It's a good question. So one of the things that I did is I actually filed a real affidavit with the state of Missouri's Attorney General, and I provided, I don't even know how many pages of documents, probably close to 300 pages of documents from the center. Those documents were also provided redacted, so all of the patient information was removed to the New York Times. And a really intensive New York Times investigation occurred. It was published, and that investigator did find that a huge number of my claims were backed up by the documents provided. In addition, since my first affidavit came out, all we have seen is more and more evidence backing up what I was putting forward. We saw the review from the UK, the CAS report, very similar findings. I have worked with some of the other whistleblowers from the UK. We had very similar things we were seeing in our centers. And then the numbers that you talked about at the beginning of this show, you were talking about data
Mm-hmm.
from insurance companies that Do No Harm put out, where Do No Harm is directly showing that these surgeries, these you know, unreversible changes are occurring across the US. Some of the worst centers, one of the worst centers is called CHOP, and it's in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It's the children's hospital there. They had some of the highest numbers of these transitions occurring. So it's okay that people don't want to believe me. I understand that. But I also understand that the data and the documentation backs up and supports what I saw directly.
Yeah, I mean, no offense to Donna there, but I just see so many people sticking their head in the sand and just pointing fingers saying, I mean, you just got done explaining a number of data and even other countries that have run into this problem. And the pushback against people like you and me, I hear it all the time. You're saying this without any evidence. There's no receipts. There's no data to back this up. And it's like, well, did you just hear what I said? And so I don't know what that is. I don't know what causes people to deny what's staring them right in the face, but I've seen that on a whole slew of different issues. This being one of the more consequential issues that people are purposely blind to or purposely ignoring. And it's a troubling thing that's occurring. But the fact, I guess you just have to keep saying it over and over until people believe you. I'd like to talk about some of the other things. You know, you mentioned Tiger, your spouse had, you said top surgery as well. And I know that there's been a number of cases who have undergone these surgeries who later regret these surgeries because it's permanent and expressing a desire to reverse it. But I've also found information that a lot of hospitals don't want to include this in their data. And a lot of the media has been pushing back saying this isn't really happening. Detransitioners are truly happy with their decision for life. But you mentioned earlier that there's a lot of detransitioners saying these types of things. Do you have any idea, like, what the percentage is on that? The kind of regret that a lot of people are having when a few years pass?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And the first thing I want to do is just express to your audience that every detransitioner is a real person who is still experiencing day to day what the fallout is from medical harms. So some of my closest and dearest friends now are detransitioners like Prisha Mosley, like Laura Becker. I know a number of people know the name Chloe Cole, but these are young women who experienced a medical intervention that was not the right thing for them, should never have happened, and they are still fighting for justice. There is no insurance code to provide them with follow-up medical care. Prisha recently had a baby and was unable to breastfeed her child and is still experiencing the medical complications of having that top surgery done to her as a young person. These individuals deserve justice and they deserve the financial support, be it through an insurance code, be it through the hospital being willing to provide them follow-up care. But we are not even doing that yet in this country because we're still arguing over whether or not these human beings that I have hugged exist.
Mm.
In addition, when we look at the numbers of detransitioners, we currently are not even counting the numbers of patients that we are putting on these things to start with. I believe what we will see long term is probably a 30% rate of individuals who have decided that they can and will try to detransition. There are also going to be a number of people who have just done this. Their bodies have been changed so permanently that they don't even see a way back. That the only thing that they can do to move forward is to continue to live in the presenting sex that they have changed their body to be.
Oh my goodness. It's tough. And as you mentioned, you've met and hugged many of these detransitioners, and they are being ignored. They're being cast aside by society. And it's very troubling. In the beginning of this process for a lot of people, and I know a bit about the psychology industry, and a lot of this is being, I guess the genesis could start in the counseling room behind closed doors with a psychologist who's now been trained to maybe suggest this is the issue for the child's anxiety or depression that they're experiencing or whatever the mental illness is, have you thought maybe that maybe you were born in the wrong body? Have you ever considered that and that kind of suggestive advice leads them down this journey of questioning and then maybe accepting that as being reality for them. What have you found in that in terms of okay, there's this suggestion by a psychologist, maybe ignoring some other deeper issues like previous abuse or whatever this maybe they have a psychotic not episode but a psychotic condition, maybe it's all the way up to schizophrenia. Why aren't those things being looked at, and how prevalent is that kind of advice that I just explained?
So, from the mental health providers, basically in this country, we have a number of states with laws that are called anti conversion laws, basically strangleholding the profession into only affirming. So we have good therapists who would want to do exploratory therapists, who would want to work with kids to get at the root of their underlying distress, their underlying anxiety or depression. And basically, we have set up these laws where the only thing they can do is if a kid says, I think I might be trans, the only answer is, yep, you must be
Mm,
trans.
mm.
There's a wonderful organization called Therapy First who are trying to support therapists around the country to be able to provide exploratory therapy to really get at the root of what the distress is. And the one thing that's really tough to kind of think about is I did see a number of patients whose parents really did buy into this. For them, it was a good thing to have a trans kid, and they were getting some social clout out
Mm.
of having a trans kid, and they really supported and really pushed this on these kids.
Yeah, I see that when you mentioned the social contagion in high schools. I know here in Michigan, there's a lot of, I think the number of kids in these schools, middle school, high school, even before that, maybe elementary school, I think the number, I don't know the exact numbers, so I'm just going to estimate, but I think it went from like, I don't know, 0.5% to about 15% now in these schools identify in some form of transgender ideology. And it's just as you had described it. But in the meantime, there's a lot of other things that might be ignored here. And you found out some situation. I want you to talk about this because you saw a case where a boy with severe OCD received hormones without any prior gender dysphoria symptoms whatsoever. Describe that, and why do you think doctors are so willing now to go down that path?
So we had patients, numbers of patients, who did not even meet what we were calling the criteria for gender dysphoria. Essentially, we have an industry where if the child claims that they are trans and the child says, I want these drugs, this medication, really the whole machinery just moves that child along and gives the kid what they want. We would see patients where in the visit, the parent would turn to the kid and say, are you sure this is what you want? Are you sure? And if the kid said yes, then all of the adults in the room were going along. Even when we had cases of kids who had severe obsessive compulsive disorder, kids who had histories of sexual abuse, trauma histories, things that you would think would make any provider first pause and say, we have to understand this part first before we physically change your body. But instead, this whole concept is if we change your body, then maybe all of those other things we think are going to go away. And there's just no evidence to support that. There is no evidence to support giving a 13-year-old girl testosterone is going to treat obsessive compulsive disorder. This literally is just outside of the realm of all kinds of good medical care.
Yeah, it's completely unscientific. So let's talk about your spouse, Tiger. She transitioned, physically, and I mean, describe her experience. Did she ever find the inner peace that she was seeking as a result of the surgery?
No, no. And Tiger actually went through the process where there was some therapy short term before starting testosterone. What scares me so much is that that was 13, 14 years ago. Now, today, you could have an 18-year-old walk into a Planned Parenthood, have a 30-minute consultation with a nurse practitioner, not even a doctor, often a nurse practitioner who has no mental health training, and you can have that 18-year-old leave with a prescription to physically medicalize their body. This is called the informed consent model, and this is what activists had been pushing for years.
Hmm.
There's an organization called WPATH. It's the World Professional Association for Transgender Healthcare. That organization was pushing for this model of care, that adults, even at 18, know what they want and they should be able to get what they want. It's essentially putting hormones into vending machines. And what we are seeing is the long-term fallout that nobody should be able to self-diagnose and self-prescribe. It's basically taking the entire reason why we train doctors out of the picture.
Mm. Yeah, and that's a good point because Planned Parenthood, by the way, I've had people deny this flat out, but I know it's true that Planned Parenthood is now a major center where they're providing these types of gender transition treatments, whether it's the hormones or maybe I don't know how they do it with the surgery, but it's a moneymaker for them, especially as more abortions now are happening through pills. They're not coming to Planned Parenthood, so they got to find another avenue to do this, and you just follow the money, and that's a big center and organization, Planned Parenthood, who is really in the mix on this whole thing. Real
If,
quickly, go ahead.
well, if your listeners want the receipts, a really good reporter, Jennifer Block, did a huge in-depth piece. It was published in the Free Press maybe 3 months ago. She really dug into the numbers in Planned Parenthood. It is their main model now. You're
Yeah.
absolutely right. They've moved away from reproductive health care and they're just transitioning teens now.
Yeah, and by the way, we're in Detroit, and there's a newspaper here called the Detroit Free Press. That's not the Free Press that Jamie is talking about. Free Press is something that Barry Weiss, a phenomenal journalist, runs that site. Free Press is not the Detroit Free Press. The Detroit Free Press would never cover this like Barry Weiss would. If they do, I'd be pleasantly surprised. But yeah, Barry Weiss, right? That's the right name
Yep,
for
you're
pre.
right.
Yeah, great publication. You should read it and look it up because they do a lot of great things. And she used to work for the New York Times, and she's a whistleblower for the New York Times and whatnot. It's a great journalist. Real quick, parent rights. How is that being impacted by this now industry?
Parental rights have, it's really become one of the wedge conversations in this issue. So, on one hand, you have parents who say, I should have the right to medically transition my child. If I can go to the doctor, this should be my right. On the flip side, we also have parents who basically are saying, I should have the right to understand what's going on in my child's school, make sure my kids are not being ideologically taught or driven into this. We have schools that are keeping secret from parents that they are using different names and pronouns with kids in schools. Really, this is one of the biggest issues within this is parents should know what is happening in their kids' school, should never be locked out of knowing if their kids are socially transitioning in schools, changing their names, changing their pronouns. And really, I think part of this is having to get parents back involved in raising our kids. Parents should be the ones to say no to children. Children want us to give them guide rails. Children want us to say, Mom, I feel like I might be a boy. And the answer should be, I'm sorry that you feel like that. You are a girl and your body will never physically change.
Yeah, be the adults that we're supposed to be as parents. How can what can people? We have all this information now, and what can people do? I mean, are we stuck with this until it finally blows over and the United States wakes up to like the UK did and Sweden, or is it something that we can do to hopefully reverse this horrific trend in this country?
So I did start an organization. We have a website, we run a Substack, it's the LGBT Courage Coalition. We are actually doing direct actions where we go to some of these giant medical conferences where we're talking one-on-one with endocrinologists, with pediatricians. We went to the American Academy of Pediatrics in Orlando. We have seen 25 states now pass laws to protect children.
Good.
which leaves us with 25 states where kids are still being harmed. What I think we need to start doing is in those states where there are still clinics operating, we need people speaking up, figuring out where the clinics are, reaching out to the boards and the donors of those hospitals and saying, not in my backyard, this needs to stop.
Right. Yeah, and be courageous. I mean, that's in the title of your organization, because you're going to get pushback, and people are going to say you're lying, or that you somehow hate children, or you want them to die. All of that is noise. Look, you just sift it out of your life and hone in on the real message here. You know that you're protecting kids by identifying, exposing what's really happening. I can't thank you enough. It's so important what you're talking about. And give people your website so they can go there and find more information.
So it's the LGBT Courage Coalition, and you can find us online. And you can
Okay.
find me on Twitter, and I
Yeah.
post all the time. I love Twitter. I'm Jamie Whistle on Twitter also.
Jamie Whistle. Okay, the whistleblower, Jamie Reed. Jamie Reed is the executive director of the LGBT Courage Coalition, and thankfully a whistleblower from the pediatric gender industry. I can't thank you enough for coming on, and I wish you all the best. I know you're going to be walking, Tiger through this process as well. So I know that's she needs you, you need her. So we wish you all the best, and we hope to talk again soon, because Michigan, where I happen to be broadcasting from, is one of those states
Yes.
that have implemented these laws that tell psychologists and counselors they have to affirm the child's new gender identity, no matter the age. And if you don't do that, we will take away your license. That's what's happening here in the state of Michigan. So keep up the fight, and we'll join with you on that fight as long as we can, Jamie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Appreciate it. Have a great day. Wow, it's an amazing thing that's happening in Michigan. And listen, the work is working. What Jamie Reed is doing there in speaking up and being courageous, this is what it takes. We're talking about all stripes, women, men, whatever your ideology is. I think we can all agree on this, that children are being harmed. If you really look at the data out there, and yes, to our previous questioner, or Donna was her name, where's the evidence of this? Where's the data? It's all around us. We know this is happening. We know, and there are case studies, I've said this time and again, in other countries where they tried this experiment and they realized the harm that will never go away based on what they allow to do in their countries. Sweden, the United Kingdom, I think Denmark might have been one of them as well, but the Netherlands is also right there. And they've realized, okay, we're really hurting kids. And this whole idea of, we're going to prevent them from committing suicide, that is a myth. By making them transition physically, it doesn't make the problem go away. It only exacerbates it in many cases. All right, I want to get to some headlines, and we'll get to more of your comments as well. You may have seen this during this pretty heated interview with Bloomberg News. Former President Donald Trump, this was yesterday in Chicago, emphasized that the GOP is now the party of common sense. Speaking at the Economic Club of Chicago, Donald Trump laid out his economic vision for a potential second term. And he responded pretty fiercely to these very negative questions about tariffs and his presuppositions about tariffs and national security. And Donald Trump said, listen, we need borders. We need fair elections. Why are people against those two things? No men in women's sports. No surgeries for minors without parental consent, which I was just speaking with Jamie Reed about. That's common sense. To some pushback from the questioner from Bloomberg. And, listen, Donald Trump defended his past record saying, listen, I had 4 years because this Bloomberg reporter said, we know that your economic policies is going to lead to inflation. Experts are saying that. He said, no, there was no inflation when I had the same policies when I was president before. In fact, I brought it down, the rate of inflation. So he outlined plans for these steep tariffs on imports to push companies to manufacture in the United States. And when challenged on the potential trade wars, Trump fired back, build your plant here and you won't have any tariffs. That is the whole point of Donald Trump's tariff policy. I actually support it, and I did back when he was president in his first term, and there was a lot of pushback from conservatives and from liberals saying this is going to raise the cost of goods in this country. But they also want these companies to come back to the United States. These are American companies going overseas to China and Mexico and elsewhere to build their products and then ship them back here because they can build them cheaply in those countries. What Donald Trump wants to do is two things. First, put tariffs on those products so they'll stop building them overseas on the cheap and then ripping off this country. But also lower taxes on corporations so they will stay in this country. Those are Donald Trump's, two major economic policy ideas he has that Kamala Harris is completely against. And what her policies will do is continue to cause American companies to go overseas, and then they'll stay there because we have, very low tariffs, while, China and the rest have very high tariffs on us. They're preventing our products from being exported into their countries from here to there, but we're making it easy for their products to be imported to the United States. So Donald Trump said, listen, and part of this is a negotiating tactic. All right, if you want to move over to Mexico, we're going to put 200% tariffs on your products. What's that going to do? They're going to say, well, maybe we won't go to Mexico. Maybe we'll stay here in the United States. And also, Donald Trump's offering us lower corporate taxes. Yeah, let's just stay put. We'll hire more people. It is common sense. These extreme ideologies, I think, need to be pushed back against. And he talked about a whole slew of issues. If you have time, pull it up. I think it's probably on YouTube. What he had there. So good stuff and good for him. And listen, the audience loved it. This is an audience of business leaders in Chicago. And they stood up, a standing ovation for Donald Trump because they were common sense economic policies that we were speaking to people who understood good economic policy for business in Chicago, Illinois. He's coming back to Detroit, Michigan on Friday. Donald Trump is. He'll be at the Huntington Place, formerly Cobo Center, in Detroit, Michigan, downtown Detroit. Also, look at this. There's a close ally of Vice President Kamala Harris. Ron Busby is his name. He's under scrutiny right now because of these revelations of meetings that he had with the Chinese Communist Party, the officials with the CCP. That's him right there, Busby. Harris, by the way, praised him as this extraordinary leader, showing courageous leadership. Well, he traveled to China as part of a New York government and business delegation, and photos from this trip show that Busby there was engaging with CCP leaders, the Chinese Communist Party, and expressing his intent to spread the voice of black business around the globe. So he wants the Chinese Communist Party to help black business owners. Severe compromise to do what? Certainly not to set them free, to put them under the thumb of the Chinese Communist Party. And there's Kamala Harris and Busby there at this in Detroit, Michigan. The economic opportunity for all. So her idea of economic opportunity for all includes partnering with the Chinese Communist Party, apparently. So that trip that Busby took, it was coordinated by the New York in China Center and backed by Chinese consulate, involved discussions about economic partnerships and resource sharing between American, African, and Chinese enterprises, resource sharing with the CCP. So what does he do? He heads the U.S. Black Chambers and later hinted at aligning resources between U.S. black businesses and Chinese entities. Is that really the best for, for black business owners in this country to partner with China? Why would you do that? It does not speak to me of economic freedom. So anyway, I wanted to bring that to your attention. That came out as well. Plus, there's these red flags on national security. When you think about this, Busby's collaboration with the CCP officials, what about the risks of aligning U.S. business interests with a regime known for foreign influence operations and human rights abuses and disappearing people who disagree with them? So this whole willingness to share resources from black businesses to China not only compromises American interests, but also opens the doors for Beijing to further entrench its influence in these vulnerable communities. So is Kamala Harris's judgment in question? Yeah, you bet it is. This glowing endorsement of this guy, calling him a courageous leader as he's trying to partner with black businesses in China and the Chinese Communist Party, that doesn't sound courageous. It sounds, I won't say what it sounds like. Doesn't sound good, though. All right, I want to bring this up. You know, the renowned Cleveland Clinic, also USC, University of Southern California, they're facing some backlash over a COVID heart risk study, which critics say buries key data to inflate concerns about heart attacks and strokes. So this is about COVID. The study initially claimed that COVID-19 doubled the long-term risk of heart-related events like heart attacks and strokes and death, even years after infection. However, supplementary data has revealed that this increased risk only applies to patients who are hospitalized. For non-hospitalized patients, the heart risk was essentially no different from people who never had COVID. So you've probably heard of Alex Berenson, former New York Times reporter. He wrote a book all about, the pandemic, and he uncovered this buried data. And it says the study selectively focuses on extreme cases to push fear-driven narratives. And the framing of the study conveniently admits that nearly 98% of adults recover from COVID without hospitalization. So we're talking about questions now about the integrity of the public health messaging that we've seen over the past 4 years regarding COVID and the pandemic and what is true and what is false and the relation of vaccines and the vaccines, potential to cause myocarditis, especially in young men. It perpetuates this whole one-size-fits-all approach without really acknowledging that prevention might just delay, not eliminate infection and risk. We're talking about prevention with the vaccine. And the public trust has been completely eroded. Listen, I had COVID once. I had natural immunity. And I will publicly admit here, because I can't, because of a medical condition I have, get the vaccine. But I know most people that are around me have, not in my family, but around me. And I think to the person, almost every single individual has had COVID multiple times, sometimes severely. And I had it once, and I hope I don't get it again. I'm not saying I'm not going to. But what we're told about the vaccines, all the disinformation about it, and the buried data that still exists to this day. What about transparency? We're talking about informed consent. What Jamie Reed was discussing regarding, transition surgeries for kids. What is the deal with our medical establishments preventing us from really knowing what's going on? These respected institutions, they're hiding this crucial data. That is what is feeding skepticism, not bringing up what's really happening, especially when their conclusions align with the political agendas that exist not only in the United States, but across the world. And I think, at least in this country, I can only speak for our country, but Americans deserve to know the truth about a whole slew of issues. So anyway, I still talk about this, even though I'm told not to talk about COVID and the pandemic 4 years after one of the biggest cover-ups I've ever seen in my lifetime and potentially ever in this country. Massive cover-up by the media, the health department in this country, governors in these blue states they still don't want you to find out what the real data is and what they knew back in 2020 about what COVID really was capable of doing and who was really capable of harming the most and who it was not capable of harming the most, and what they were warned about from places like the National Institutes of Health. And they buried that data in relation to the quarantines and the lockdowns, the harm that would come from that and not from the COVID pandemic. All right. I'd love to hear from you. Cameron, do you have any more comments here we can throw up on the screen real quickly, or are we good? Here's go. Jordan Genso, I think I would make for a fascinating conversation to see someone participate in this discussion. Let's put it back up. I didn't finish reading it. Put it back up. I can't see it. Jordan Genso, I'd love to have you on. Actually, I have a plan for you, and we should touch base. To see someone participate in this discussion, coming at it from the other perspective. I wonder if Jordan is talking about the detransitioning thing from actually have somebody coming from another perspective. That's what we've been doing in the media the whole time. It is rare to hear from that woman's perspective. And Jordan, I'd love to have you on. I know you're a good guy, and I know people who know you, and I'd like to get to know you as well. So we'll have you on. But the idea that we're not talking about this from the other perspective, I'm sorry, is absurd. That is the majority perspective that the media focuses in on, is that we need to transition these children who believe that they are the opposite gender from what they're born in. Their bodies were born as a male, but they think they're a female, or vice versa. So the media narrative has been just that. How many times do you see Jamie Reed come out? Very rarely. Dr. Phil had her on. Certainly, I don't think any of these local affiliates in Detroit, Michigan, like the ABC and CBS and NBC and the Fox, and they don't have people like her on. At least if they do, it's not from let's really seriously consider what she's saying here about the legitimacy. This is why I'm having these conversations from this perspective so often on this program, because the others are not. There's a few very good now independent journalists who will discuss these issues very honestly, but most do not. So I'll have you on. I'm pretty sure I know what you're going to say because I've been talking about this for years with people from your perspective. So I thought it would be nice to have someone come on from that perspective who's lived this life and has seen firsthand what's happening to children, has seen firsthand from her spouse who now wants to detransition because of the never-ending harm that's been done to her body. And by the way, never brought her the lasting peace she was told it was going to. But Jordan, I would like to have you on, and we'll have a nice conversation. In fact, I'd like to have you on and maybe a conservative, and you guys we'll have a little mini debate with, non-actively running politicians who come from a different ideology, and let's kind of hash it out together. I would love that. So we'll be in contact with you. Any more comments there, Cameron? Ferris Happenings, Abigail Schreier. Irreversible Damage, More Proof for Those Looking for It. That is a phenomenal book. I have that book, Irreversible Damage, from Abigail Schreier. That is somebody else who's being called a hateful individual, but she has the receipts. Read that book. It is so hard to read through because she has real life cases of what has happened to people. And not only that, the movement amongst social media to get your kids to join these, maybe it's like an art club. Hey, you like to paint? We'd like to invite you to our art club. And really what they're doing is they're getting people into the transgender movement. It is a social contagion, and it is spreading rapidly around this country, not because people are really truly suffering from gender dysphoria. It's because they're being intimidated to get involved, and they're being pressured. And Abigail Schreier does a phenomenal job at spelling that out. If you don't believe me, that's fine. Read Abigail Schreier. If you don't believe her, that's fine. That's on you. But she has the receipts. And it's a phenomenal read. And a lot of people are starting to wake up, thankfully. Ferris Happenings, thank you for that reminder. I appreciate that so much. Any more, Cameron? Is that it? Arlene, thank you for commenting. Thank you for discussing this life-altering health, mental, physical, and emotional issue. My background is healthcare. First, do no harm. Puberty isn't even completed until after 18 years of age. Arlene knows what she's talking about, and she's right. Did you know, by the way, that one of the findings from the United Kingdom and places like Sweden, I think Denmark might have been another one, but one of the findings they had when they finally outlawed gender transition surgeries for minors is that the vast majority of these cases and these feelings that these kids had stopped when they hit puberty. They went away and they realized, oh, that was just a phase I was going through. And that is one of the reasons why, and they're openly admitting it, we want to give you these puberty blockers before you hit puberty, because if you hit puberty, your feelings might change back to how they were naturally created to be. So let's stop puberty from happening so you will never be fixed. That's my take on what's, but they also openly admit they don't want puberty to ever hit these kids, because likely they know that if that does, they will return to how they were meant to be, at least feeling that way. Arlene, thank you so much. I do appreciate it. It was a very important conversation, and I know it's controversial to talk about these things, but it's necessary. And it's only controversial because I will say it is primarily the left, and I understand that Jamie Reed is liberal, and good for her. There's a lot of liberal people I know, too, that are not supportive of this, but it is primarily happening from the left side of the political parties in this country, that they are pushing this harmful ideology on kids and on adults, and it has affected the psychology industry by these laws now in states like Michigan now that if you're a psychologist, you're a counselor or a therapist of some kind, you cannot tell a young kid who walks into your office that they feel like they're actually a girl when they were born a boy, your only recourse is to affirm that thought and to guide that child on that path. If you go the other way, you will lose your license. And now, the state of Michigan, they just passed new funding for mental health care, like $130 million for mental health care for schools. Well, guess what? You can only find the mental health care that aligns with this destructive ideology. That's the only kind that they will allow with this millions and millions of dollars to fund that in your schools, your kids' schools. That's the only way, that's the only recourse. So it's incredibly damaging. I support Jamie Reed in her fight to make sure that more states reverse the tide before it's too late. Remember, you can always follow us. TomJordanLive.com is how you can find out where we are located, but we're on YouTube and X and Facebook and Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe to Tom Jordan Live. That helps us out a ton. Thanks so much. God bless you. We'll see you next time.